The Holy Roman Emperor didn't die a hero. He died a monster. The black pox made him bleed from his eyes and turned his body into a rotting purple mass. But the true horror happened after he took his last breath. His corpse was so swollen with gas that undertakers had to physically snap his neck just to force the coffin lid shut. The horror of his end stood in grotesque contrast to the vitality of his beginning. Joseph was the genetic anomaly the dynasty had prayed for. Tall, ruddy, a hunter and a dancer who lived with a ferocious appetite for life. He was the physical manifestation of the empire's future. But the city he ruled was a beautiful lie. Vienna in 1711 was a place of soaring cathedrals and gilded palaces floating on a sea of filth. Beneath the incense and perfume lay the stench of open sewers and slaughterhouses. It was a city teeming with life and therefore teeming with death. The killer was always there, lurking in the crowded tenements, in the dirty linens of the poor, in the very air the city breathed. Smallpox, variola major. It was the speckled monster, a demon that had haunted humanity for thousands of years. In the 18th century, it was an accepted grim reaper, taking a third of those it touched. But the Habsburgs, for all their stone walls and Swiss guards, were terrified of it. They had lost family members to it before. It was the one enemy their armies could not fight. It began innocuously, as these things always do, a headache, a slight fever, a general sense of malaise that a man as active as Joseph might dismiss as fatigue from the endless meetings and strategizing against Louis XIV. It was early April. The spring air was just beginning to warm the cold stone of the Hofburg. The emperor complained of feeling heated. The court physicians, a gaggle of men in heavy robes, armed with little more than lancets for bleeding and herbal poultices, hovered nervously. To diagnose an emperor is a dangerous game. Declare it a cold, and you might be negligent. Declare it a plague, and you plunge the stock markets of Europe into chaos. So they watched. They waited. They prayed it was merely a chill. But the biology of the virus does not wait for protocol. Deep inside Joseph's body, the replication had already begun. The virus had entered through his respiratory tract days earlier, perhaps while he was inspecting a regiment, or passing a crowded street, or simply breathing the same air as a carrier. It had silently migrated to his lymph nodes. It was multiplying in his spleen, his bone marrow. It was flooding his bloodstream. By the time the first true symptoms manifested, the war was already lost. The headache transformed into a splitting, blinding agony as if an axe had been buried in his skull. The back pain, a classic telltale sign of smallpox, arrived next. It is described as a shearing sensation, a deep muscular ache that makes lying down impossible, and standing up torture. Then came the fever. It spiked violently, sending the emperor into delirious shivers. The man who could command armies was suddenly unable to command his own limbs. He was stripped, bathed in vinegar and water, and laid in his great state bed. The heavy curtains were drawn, plunging the room into a twilight that would soon become a dungeon. The court held its breath. The word smallpox was whispered in the corridors, but hope remained. After all, people survived smallpox. It was a terrible ordeal, yes, but a strong man like Joseph in the prime of his life, surely he would weather the storm. He would emerge scarred, perhaps pockmarked like so many of his subjects, but alive. But then the rash appeared, and this is where the story shifts from a medical drama to a horror story. In a typical case of smallpox, the rash begins as small red spots on the tongue and in the mouth. These spots turn into sores that break open, spreading large amounts of the virus into the saliva. Then the rash appears on the skin, starting on the face and spreading to the arms and legs. These spots usually turn into raised, fluid-filled blisters, pustules. They are horrific, painful, and itchy, but they are the standard course of the disease. The physicians leaned over the sweating, groaning form of the emperor, holding candles close to his skin to inspect the first lesions. What they saw made their blood run cold. The spots were not raised. They were flat. And they were not red. They were dark, a deep, dusky purple, bordering on black. They looked at each other in the flickering light, and they knew. They didn't have the modern terminology. They didn't know about thrombocytopenia or cytokine storms, but they knew the black pox. They knew that when the spots were flat and purple, it meant the blood was not staying in the veins. It meant that the very structure of the emperor's body was failing. This was purpura variolosa, hemorrhagic smallpox. It is a rare presentation of the disease occurring in perhaps 1 to 3% of cases, almost always in adults. It is practically uniformly fatal, and it is a death of such profound violence that it seems designed to mock the sanctity of the human form. The virus was attacking the endothelial cells, the thin layer of cells that line the blood vessels. It was dissolving the walls of the emperor's veins and arteries. He was beginning to bleed internally, everywhere, all at once. The black pox does not just kill you, it dismantles you. The dark purple spots on Joseph's skin were subcutaneous hemorrhages, bleeding under the skin. His beautiful royal skin was becoming a canvas of bruises that grew and merged until entire sections of his body turned a terrifying necrotic black. It looked as though he had been beaten with clubs or burned by an invisible fire. But the bleeding did not stay under the skin. The horror of hemorrhagic smallpox is that the blood seeks an exit. By the second week of April, the atmosphere in the imperial bedchamber had changed from anxiety to abject terror. The smell of iron, the metallic tang of fresh blood, began to mingle with the heavy scent of incense and sickness. The emperor, the most powerful man in Christendom, began to weep blood, not metaphorically, literally. The capillaries in his conjunctiva burst, and red tears leaked from his swollen eyes, tracking down cheeks that were turning the color of charcoal. His gums began to ooze. His nose began to bleed, not a trickle, but a steady, unstoppable flow that soaked the pillows and the sheets. When he coughed, he brought up bright, foamy blood from lungs that were slowly filling with fluid. When he urinated, it was the color of port wine. The physicians were helpless. They applied poultices. They bled him, a cruel irony, taking blood from a man who was already losing it from every pore. They forced cordials and tonics down a throat that was raw and ulcerated, but they were trying to put out a forest fire with a thimble of water. The psychological toll on the court was immense. The Habsburgs were obsessed with image, with protocol, with the divine dignity of the monarch. Yet here was their sovereign, disintegrating before their eyes. He was becoming a monster. The swelling began to set in, edema caused by the failing kidneys and the leakage of fluid into the tissues. His face, that handsome chiseled face of the portraits, puffed up. The eyes swelled shut. The lips turned outward, cracked and bleeding. His mother, the Empress Eleanor Magdalene, a woman of iron will who had survived wars and sieges, came to his bedside. She had birthed him. She had watched him grow into the golden hope of the dynasty. But when she looked at the thing writhing on the bed, this blackened, swollen, bleeding entity, she recoiled. She did not recognize her own son. The disease had stolen his identity before it had even stolen his life. The pain must have been excruciating, not just the surface pain of the skin, which felt as though it were being flayed, but the deep, crushing ache of internal pressure. His organs were drowning, his joints were filling with blood, and through it all, Joseph remained lucid for much of the time, trapped in a failing prison, aware of the horror that he had become. He could smell his own decay. He could taste the blood in his mouth that never went away. Outside the palace walls, the city of Vienna held its breath. Rumors flew. The emperor was recovering. The emperor was dying. The emperor was already dead. Churches were filled with people praying for a miracle. But the god of the Habsburgs seemed to have turned his face away. Inside the room, the air was heavy, hot, and stifling. The windows were kept closed, as was the custom, trapping the foul air. The servants moved like ghosts, their faces covered with cloths soaked in vinegar to ward off the infection and the smell. They changed the sheets, stripping away linen soaked in blood and black fluid, only to replace them and watch them stain again within the hour. It was a conveyor belt of horror. As April 17th approached, the end became inevitable. The emperor's breathing grew ragged, a wet rattling sound that echoed off the high ceilings. This was the death rattle, the sound of fluid accumulation in the throat. His heart, straining to pump blood that was losing its ability to clot, began to flutter. Joseph I, the man who had dreamed of a united Europe, who had danced in the ballrooms of Vienna, who had led the charge against the French, was now alone in the most profound sense. All the power of the Holy Roman Empire could not buy him a single breath of ease. He was being digested by the virus. And yet, as horrific as these final days were, they were only the prologue. The true descent into the macabre, the final insult to the imperial dignity, would not happen until his heart stopped beating. Because the body of Joseph I was not done with its performance. The black pox had one final gruesome trick to play. The death of the man was just the beginning of the nightmare for the corpse. The silence that descended on the imperial bedchamber at shortly after midday on April 17th, 1711, was not the respectful hush of a tragedy. It was the terrified silence of a crime scene. Joseph Thurcy was dead. The agonizing, heaving breaths that had filled the room for days had finally ceased, replaced by a stillness that felt heavier than the velvet curtains blocking out the spring sun. The physicians, exhausted and defeated, stepped back from the bed. The priests, their hands trembling as they held their crucifixes, muttered the final absolutions over a mass of flesh that bore no resemblance to the man who had ruled the Holy Roman Empire just weeks before. But while the man was gone, the biology remained, and in the case of hemorrhagic smallpox, the death of the host does not signal the end of the activity. It signals the beginning of a riot. As the funeral preparations began, the corpse ceased to be a person and became a volatile biological environment. Usually, when a human being dies, there is a pause. The heart stops, the blood settles, the body cools. Rigor mortis sets in slowly, starting in the small muscles and spreading to the large ones over the course of several hours. Decomposition is a slow, methodical process, a gradual breakdown of tissues that takes days or weeks to become truly offensive. Joseph's body did not follow these rules. The black pox had already done the work of decomposition while he was still alive. For days, his blood had been leaking out of his veins and pooling in his tissues. His body temperature had been raging at fever pitch. His immune system had been obliterated. The bacteria that naturally live in the human gut, the flora that aid digestion, were no longer held in check by a living immune system, and they were sitting in a bath of warm, extravasated blood. It was a perfect, nutrient-rich incubator. The moment Joseph's heart stopped pumping, these bacteria began to multiply with explosive speed. This was not the slow, cold decay of a normal corpse. This was a fermentation. Within the first hour after death, the physicians and attendants noticed something wrong. The body was not cooling down. If anything, it seemed to retain a sinister, unnatural heat, fueled by the rampant bacterial activity consuming the nutrient-rich fluids filling his cavities. The chill of death that poets write about was absent. In its place was the humid, feverish heat of a compost heap. Then came the color. The deep purple and black bruising that had covered his skin during the final days of the illness began to shift. The hemoglobin in the spilled blood, now deoxygenated and breaking down, started to turn green. It began at the abdomen, a sickly, vibrant verdigris that spread outward like a stain on a map. The black pox had one final, gruesome trick to play. The death of the man was just the beginning of the nightmare for the corpse. The silence that descended on the imperial bedchamber at shortly after midday on April 17th, 1711, was not the respectful hush of a tragedy. It was the terrified silence of a crime scene. Joseph the Fern was dead. The agonizing, heaving breaths that had filled the room for days had finally ceased, replaced by a stillness that felt heavier than the velvet curtains blocking out the spring sun. The physicians, exhausted and defeated, stepped back from the bed. The priests, their hands trembling as they held their crucifixes, muttered the final absolutions over a mass of flesh that bore no resemblance to the man who had ruled the Holy Roman Empire just weeks before. But while the man was gone, the biology remained. And in the case of hemorrhagic smallpox, the death of the host does not signal the end of the activity. It signals the beginning of a riot. As the funeral preparations began, the corpse ceased to be a person and became a volatile biological environment. Usually, when a human being dies, there is a pause. The heart stops, the blood settles, the body cools. Rigor mortis sets in slowly, starting in the small muscles and spreading to the large ones over the course of several hours. Decomposition is a slow, methodical process, a gradual breakdown of tissues that takes days or weeks to become truly offensive. Joseph's body did not follow these rules. The black pox had already done the work of decomposition while he was still alive. For days, his blood had been leaking out of his veins and pooling in his tissues. His body temperature had been raging at fever pitch. His immune system had been obliterated. The bacteria that naturally live in the human gut, the flora that aid digestion, were no longer held in check by a living immune system, and they were sitting in a bath of warm, extravasated blood. It was a perfect, nutrient-rich incubator. The moment Joseph's heart stopped pumping, these bacteria began to multiply with explosive speed. This was not the slow, cold decay of a normal corpse. This was a fermentation. Within the first hour after death, the physicians and attendants noticed something wrong. The body was not cooling down. If anything, it seemed to retain a sinister, unnatural heat, fueled by the rampant bacterial activity consuming the nutrient-rich fluids filling his cavities. The chill of death that poets write about was absent. In its place was the humid, feverish heat of a compost heap. Then came the color, the deep purple and black bruising that had covered his skin during the final days of the illness began to shift. The hemoglobin in the spilled blood, now deoxygenated and breaking down, started to turn green. It began at the abdomen, a sickly, vibrant verdigris that spread outward like a stain on a map. It would show the world that the emperor was just meat, and rotten meat at that. Moreover, the physicians raised a terrified alarm. The body was a biological bomb. The effluvia, the gases and fluids leaking from the corpse, were believed to be highly contagious. In the 18th century understanding of miasma theory, the very air around the body was poisonous. Anyone who breathed it, anyone who touched the skin was at risk of the same horrific death. The order was given: skip the autopsy, skip the embalming. Usually, a Habsburg corpse underwent a complex tripartite burial. The heart was removed and placed in a silver urn to be buried in the Augustiner Kirche. The intestines were removed and placed in a copper urn for the Stephansdom. The rest of the body was embalmed and placed in the Kaisergruft. But there was no way to perform these surgeries on Joseph. To cut into the abdomen now, distended as it was with pressurized gas, would be disastrous. It would release a burst of infectious, putrid gas that would clear the room. The tissue was so necrotic that it would likely fall apart under the scalpel. There was no blood left to drain. It had already extravasated into the flesh. So, for one of the few times in Habsburg history, the ritual was abandoned out of pure physical necessity. The heart would stay in the chest. The intestines would stay in the belly. The priority shifted from honor to containment. They needed to get him into a box, fast. The carpenters and the coffin makers were summoned. The lead coffin, heavy and lined with chemicals to absorb moisture, was prepared. The wooden outer shell, carved with symbols of eternity, was brought into the room. But nature was moving faster than the carpenters. The speed of the decomposition was accelerating. The bacteria were exponential. Every hour they wasted debating protocol, the body expanded further. The rigor mortis, which usually sets in and locks the body into a pose, was fighting against the pressure of the gas. The muscles were stiffening, but the gas was inflating them, creating a rigid, swollen statue that was defying the natural geometry of the human form. The servants, their faces wrapped in layers of cloth, approached the bed to lift him. It was a nightmare task. The skin was slipping, a phenomenon where the top layer of skin detaches from the decomposing dermis underneath. When they grabbed his arms to lift him, the skin simply slid off in their gloved hands, leaving raw, weeping flesh beneath. They had to use sheets to hoist the body, cradling the leaking, heavy mass of the emperor like a sack of wet grain. They moved him from the bed, the linen soaked through with the dark fluids of his dissolution, and carried him toward the coffin that stood waiting in the center of the room. The mood was frantic. The dignity of the court had collapsed. There were no prayers being chanted now, only shouted instructions and the sounds of heavy breathing and retching. The goal was simple: hide the horror, seal the lead, solder it shut, stop the smell, stop the sight. They lowered him toward the coffin. It was a standard size built to the measurements of a tall, healthy man. It was lined with satin and velvet, a soft bed for an eternal sleep. But as they lowered the swollen, distorted body of Joseph I into the narrow confines of the casket, the final, cruelest complication revealed itself. The gas had done its work too well. The rigor mortis had locked his joints in a position that was incompatible with the box. The body was too wide, the chest was too high, and the head was the problem. Because of the swelling in the neck and the stiffness of the spine, the emperor's head was forced backward, his chin jutting toward the ceiling, his neck arched in a rigid, unyielding curve. He looked as though he were screaming at the heavens. They laid him down, his shoulders wedged against the sides of the coffin, his stomach pressed against the top edge. but his head remained elevated, propped up by the swollen trapezius muscles and the locked vertebrae. They tried to push him down. He would not move. The body was as stiff as wood and as tight as a drum. The lead lid was brought over. They tried to place it on top. It wouldn't close. The emperor's face, that ruined purple mask, was protruding above the rim of the coffin. The room went silent again, save for the buzzing of flies that had already found the scent. The Lord Chamberlain looked at the undertakers. The undertakers looked at the physicians. The smell was becoming unbearable. The risk of infection was rising by the second. They could not build a new coffin. It would take days, and by then the body might literally burst. They could not leave him like this. They had to close the lid, and the only way to close the lid was to change the shape of the body. The reverence for the sovereign, the divine right of kings, the sacredness of the imperial person, all of it evaporated in the face of the physics of a rotting corpse. They needed him flat, and he was not flat. The undertaker stepped forward. They were large men accustomed to the grim realities of death, but even they hesitated. This was the emperor, but the look in the eyes of the court officials told them there was no choice. Do it. Just get it done. One of the men moved to the head of the coffin. He placed his heavy gloved hands on the emperor's forehead and chin. Another man placed his hands on the emperor's chest, right over the sternum that was straining against the skin. They looked at each other. They took a breath of the foul air. And then they prepared to apply force to the sacred body of Joseph I. The hands that now gripped the anointed head of the emperor were not gentle. They could not afford to be. In the flickering candlelight of that suffocating room, the distinction between a monarch and a problem had vanished. Joseph I, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Bohemia, King of Hungary, Archduke of Austria, was now simply an obstruction. He was a biological obstacle that refused to fit into the geometry of his final containment. The undertakers, men whose names have been lost to history, but whose actions would echo in the dark corners of Habsburg lore forever, stood over the open coffin. They were sweating profusely. The heat in the room was stifling, a mixture of the unseasonably warm April air, the hundreds of burning beeswax candles, and the humid, cloying heat radiating from the decomposing body itself. They breathed shallowly through their vinegar-soaked masks, their eyes watering from the ammonia-rich stench of the purging fluids. The problem was simple physics. The lead coffin, designed weeks or months in advance based on the standard measurements of a living man, was an unforgiving vessel. It had no give. It had no flexibility. It was a rigid metal envelope. The body, however, had changed. The gases of putrefaction, methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide, had inflated the tissues of the emperor's neck and upper back. The rigor mortis, the chemical locking of the muscle fibers that occurs after death, had frozen his spine in a slight arch, likely caused by the final agonizing convulsions of his death throes. His chin was thrust upward. His head was tilted back. The crown of his head sat inches higher than the rim of the lead coffin. If they tried to place the heavy lid on top now, it would rest squarely on the emperor's face, crushing the nose and forehead, but failing to seal the sides. And a seal was non-negotiable. The air in the room was already poison. If they carried him through the streets unsealed, the trail of stench would cause a riot. The Lord Chamberlain, standing in the corner with a scented handkerchief pressed so hard against his nose that his knuckles were white, gave the nod. It was a gesture of defeat, a silent permission to commit sacrilege in the name of necessity. The lead undertaker, A man perhaps accustomed to the silence of the dead, but surely unprepared for the violence of this moment, moved his hands to the emperor's forehead. He placed one palm on the brow, right over the blackened, peeling skin where the black pox had first shown its terrifying mark. He placed his other hand under the chin, gripping the jaw that was locked tight by rigor. His assistant moved to the chest. He placed his weight on the sternum, pressing down on the rib cage that was taut and resonant with trapped gas. "Push," the whisper came. They pushed. At first there was no movement. The body of Joseph I was stone. The rigor mortis of a young, athletic man is formidable. The muscles of the neck, the sternocleidomastoid, the trapezius, were hard as wood. The gas pressure inside the tissues acted like a pneumatic tire, resisting the force, pushing back against the living hands. The undertaker grunted, shifting his footing on the slick floor. He leaned his entire body weight onto the emperor's face. He was no longer treating this as a person. He was fighting a mechanism. He needed to break the angle. He needed to force the chin down to the chest. The tension in the room was palpable. The only sounds were the strained breathing of the workers and the wet, shifting noises coming from inside the coffin as the body was compressed. Fluids, dark, necrotic, infectious, began to squeeze out from the corners of the emperor's mouth and eyes, under the pressure, trickling down into the velvet lining of the casket. They pushed harder. The assistant on the chest drove his knees into the side of the coffin for leverage, pressing down with all his might on the bloated torso. The lead undertaker wrenched the head forward, applying torque to the cervical spine that would have killed a living man instantly. And then the room heard it. It was not a clean snap like a dry twig. It was a wet, dull, sickening crack, a sound of crepitus, the grinding of bone against bone, followed by a sudden violent release of tension. Crack. The noise echoed off the stone walls louder than a pistol shot in the silence of the crypt. It was the sound of the cervical vertebrae, the C1 and C2, the atlas and the axis, giving way under the strain. The ligaments, dried and tightened by the disease and the rigor, tore with a sound like ripping canvas. The resistance vanished instantly. The emperor's head collapsed forward. The chin slammed down onto the chest, burying itself in the swollen flesh of the neck. The forehead dropped below the rim of the coffin. The body, broken and folded, finally submitted to the dimensions of the box. For a second, nobody moved. The violence of the act hung in the air. They had just broken the neck of the Holy Roman Emperor. They had manhandled the shadow of God on earth, as if he were a piece of faulty furniture. But there was no time for guilt. The smell, agitated by the movement and the release of gas from the compression, surged up from the coffin in a fresh, nauseating wave. It was a thick, visible miasma. "The lid!" someone shouted, breaking the trance. The heavy sheet of lead was lifted by 4 men. They shuffled forward, their boots slipping on the fluid that had dripped onto the floor. They positioned the lid over the coffin, casting a shadow over the ruined, blackened face of Joseph I. With a heavy metallic thud, the lid came down. Darkness finally claimed him. The sight of the golden prince, twisted and broken, was gone, but the danger was not. Solder it. Now. The plumbers, yes, plumbers, were part of the imperial funeral retinue for this exact purpose, stepped forward with their irons and their braziers. The heat in the room spiked again as the fires were stoked. They worked with frantic speed. The lead had to be melted and dripped into the seam between the coffin and the lid to create a hermetic seal. The hissing of the hot iron against the lead mixed with the sound of the prayer the priests had finally resumed. A low, trembling chant of De Profundis. "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord." As the molten lead flowed into the gap, sealing the emperor in his metal prison, the courtiers began to back away. They were terrified. They had breathed the air. They had seen the fluids. In 1711, the fear of contagion was absolute. They believed that the seeds of the disease were invisible, floating demons that could latch onto their clothes, their wigs, their skin. By the time the last inch of the coffin was soldered shut, Joseph I was no longer a body. He was a cargo. He was a sealed vessel containing a biological catastrophe. The wooden outer coffin was brought in, a magnificent thing of polished oak and gold leaf, carved with the complex heraldry of the Habsburgs. The lead shell was lowered inside it. The difference between the exterior and the interior could not have been more stark. Outside, gold, velvet, the double-headed eagle of the empire. Inside, a broken-necked, decomposing slurry of organic matter that had once been the hope of Europe. But the ordeal was not over. They had to move him. Schönbrunn Palace is not in the center of Vienna. It is an estate outside the city walls. The imperial crypt, the Kaisergruft, is in the heart of the city beneath the Capuchin church. Usually this journey is a grand procession. The streets are lined with thousands of subjects. The bells of St. Stephen's Cathedral toll. The horses are draped in black velvet. Not this time. It was decided that the transfer must happen quickly and, ideally, under the cover of darkness. The court terrified of the mob. If the people of Vienna, already on edge from the plague and the war, knew the true state of the emperor's death, if they smelled the rot, panic could ensue. There were rumors that the black pox was a curse, a judgment from God. So, in the dead of night, a stripped-down cortege assembled in the courtyard of Schönbrunn. The hearse was waiting. The horses nervous and skittish, perhaps smelling the lingering scent of death that clung to the coffin despite the lead seal, stamped their hooves on the cobblestones. The coffin was heavy. Lead is dense, and Joseph had been a large man. It took 8 men to lift it onto the carriage. As they did, they could hear the slosh of fluid inside. The gas had turned much of the emperor's internal organs into liquid. The movement of the box created a shifting weight, a gruesome reminder that the thing inside was unstable. The procession moved out into the night. There were no torches, save for the few necessary to see the road. No music, no weeping crowds, just the clatter of hooves and the creak of the carriage wheels. They moved through the silent streets of Vienna. The city was asleep, unaware that its master was passing by in a sealed metal box, his neck broken, his body a ruin. The juxtaposition was haunting. Above them the same moon shone that had illuminated Joseph's triumphal entries into the city after his military victories. Now it lit his surreptitious exit. They arrived at the Neuermarkt, the square where the Capuchin church stands. The monks were waiting. The Capuchin friars are a begging order. They wear simple brown robes. They are sworn to poverty and humility. And for centuries, they have been the guardians of the Habsburg dead. They knew the protocol. They knew the ritual of the knocking. Usually, the master of ceremonies strikes the door of the crypt with a staff. The monk inside asks, "Who desires admission?" The master of ceremonies lists the emperor's titles. Joseph, by the grace of God, Emperor of the Romans, King of Germany, King of Hungary, King of Bohemia. The monk responds, "We do not know him." The titles are repeated, shorter this time. "We do not know him." Finally, the master of ceremonies says, "Joseph, a mortal, sinful man." And the monk replies, "Let him enter." But on this night, the ritual felt different. It wasn't just a piece of theater. It was a frantic plea to get the coffin underground before it exploded. The doors were opened. The cool, damp air of the crypt rushed out to meet the warm night. The coffin was carried down the narrow stairs. The descent into the Kaisergruft is a descent into history. The air down there is different, still heavy, smelling of old wax, stone, and the metallic tang of bronze. They moved past the sarcophagi of his ancestors, past his father, Leopold I, past the great bronze chest of his grandfather. They brought him to his designated spot. The friars, faces obscured by their hoods, chanted the final prayers, but their eyes were on the coffin. They could hear the pressure inside. The lead was strong, but the forces of decomposition are stronger. There were stories, horrible, whispered stories, of coffins in the crypt bursting weeks after burial, showering the stone floor with liquid, and filling the church above with an unholy stench. They prayed that the soldering would hold. They lowered the heavy wooden and lead box into the outer sarcophagus, the great ornate metal monument that tourists see today. This outer shell was the final mask. It was a masterpiece of Baroque art, covered in skulls wearing crowns, weeping angels, and eagles with spread wings. It was designed to look eternal, unshakable, majestic. It was a lie wrapped in bronze. As the lid of the sarcophagus was lowered, sealing Joseph I away from the world of the living forever, the men in the crypt let out a collective breath. It was done. The monster was contained. The broken neck, the blackened skin, the weeping eyes, it was all hidden now, buried under tons of metal and stone. But the story of Joseph's death did not stay in the crypt. You cannot break an emperor's neck and expect silence. The servants talked. The undertakers drank in the taverns and whispered. The physicians wrote their private diaries. The horror of the black pox and the violence of the coffining became a dark legend in Vienna. It became a cautionary tale about the vanity of human power. Joseph I had been the Sun King of Austria. He had built the Schönbrunn Palace to rival Versailles. He had dreamed of a dynasty that would rule the world, and in the end, he had been bent, broken, and soldered into a box like hazardous waste. And yet, as the crypt doors closed and the procession dispersed into the night, leaving the emperor to his dark, lonely disintegration, a new question began to rise. The king was dead. The throne was empty, but the virus was not dead. The black pox had tasted imperial blood. It had proven that no walls could keep it out. And as the dawn broke over Vienna on the morning of April 18th, 1711, the city woke up to a terrifying realization. If the emperor could rot, what hope was there for the rest of them? The death of Joseph was the end of a man, but it was the beginning of a new era of fear. And deep in the crypt, inside the lead box, the pressure continued to build. The bacteria did not know the funeral was over. They were still feasting. And miles away, a courier was riding hard for Barcelona. He carried a letter sealed with black wax. He was writing to Charles, Joseph's younger brother. He was writing to tell him that he was now the emperor. He was writing to tell him that the crown was his, but he did not know, could not know, that the man he was writing to was about to inherit not just a throne, but a curse of blood, of madness, and of a dynasty that was slowly, inevitably eating itself alive. For the horror of the Habsburgs was not just in their deaths, it was in their blood, and the black pox was only one of the monsters lurking in the DNA of the most powerful family on earth. The sun that rose over Vienna on April 18th, 1711, illuminated a city that was holding its breath. The great bells of St. Stephen's Cathedral were tolling, a deep, rhythmic iron pulse that vibrated through the cobblestones, signaling to the bakers, the smiths, and the washerwomen that the unthinkable had happened. The emperor was dead. But the city did not know the truth. They did not know about the black necrotic skin. They did not know about the fluid leaking from the eyes, and they certainly did not know that their sovereign, the Golden Prince, had been folded into his coffin like a broken doll, his neck snapped by the desperate hands of terrified undertakers. To the public, this was a tragedy of state. To the few who had been in that room, it was a biological crime scene. The immediate aftermath of Joseph I's death was not a period of mourning, but of sanitation. The imperial bedchamber in the Schönbrunn Palace, now empty of its royal occupant, was a hazard zone. In the 18th century, the concept of germs was unknown, but the concept of miasma, bad air, was absolute. The air in that room was considered poison. It was believed that the seeds of the black pox were clinging to the velvet curtains, the tapestries, the wood of the bed frame, and the very plaster of the walls. The servants who entered the room that morning were not the usual maids in starched aprons. They were men wrapped in thick canvas, their faces obscured by masks soaked in vinegar and camphor. They moved with the grim efficiency of those clearing a battlefield. The bed linens, the finest silk and linen in Europe, embroidered with the imperial crest, were stiff with dried blood and the dark, sticky fluids of decomposition. They were not washed. They were bundled up, carried to the courtyards, and burned. The smoke that rose from the palace chimneys that morning was thick and greasy, carrying the scent of burning fabric and the faint, unmistakable odor of organic decay. The mattress, soaked through with the fluids that had purged from the emperor's body during the violent swelling of the previous night, was dragged out and destroyed. The floorboards, stained with the drippings of the corpse as it had been carried to the coffin, were scrubbed with lye and strong spirits. The windows were thrown open to the spring air, desperate to chase away the smell that seemed to have settled into the very atoms of the palace. But the smell was stubborn. It lingered in the upholstery. It clung to the wigs of the courtiers who had stood vigil. For weeks afterward, people claimed they could still smell the sickness in the corridors of Schönbrunn, a phantom scent of copper and rot that no amount of incense could mask. While the palace was being purged, a different kind of horror was unfolding in the minds of the Habsburg theologians and priests. The Habsburgs were not just rulers, they were the Catholic sword of Europe. Their rituals were their armor. And in the haste to seal the leaking, exploding body of Joseph I into lead, a sacred tradition had been violated. For centuries, a Habsburg emperor was never buried whole. It was a tripartite burial. The heart was removed to be placed in the Augustinerkirche, the heart crypt, as an offering to God. The viscera, the intestines, the liver, the stomach, were removed and placed in copper urns in the crypt of St. Stephen's Cathedral. Only the husk, the muscles and bones, went to the Capuchin crypt. This was not just macabre tradition, it was theology. It was a way of distributing the sanctity of the emperor across the holy sites of the city. But Joseph I was buried whole. Because of the terrifying speed of the hemorrhagic smallpox and the explosive production of gas, the surgeons had refused to open the body. They knew that one cut into that distended abdomen would have released a pressurized cloud of infectious gas that could have killed everyone in the room. They dared not reach into the chest to sever the aorta and remove the heart, for fear of the necrotic tissue disintegrating in their hands. So Joseph went to his grave with his heart rotting inside his chest and his intestines fermenting in his belly. To the devout minds of the court, this was a spiritual disaster. It was as if the disease had not only claimed his life, but had denied him the final purifying rites of his dynasty. He was trapped in his own corruption, sealed in lead, denied the separation that his ancestors enjoyed. The silence in the Capuchin crypt that morning was heavy. The monks, the guardians of the dead, moved softly around the fresh sarcophagus. They were afraid. There was a genuine fear among the brotherhood that the coffin might burst. The phenomenon of the exploding casket was a known reality in the age before embalming. If the gas pressure inside the hermetically sealed lead liner continued to build, and if the soldering was imperfect, the lead could rupture. The monks kept their distance. They lit candles, but they did not linger near the bronze tomb. They listened. In the quiet of the crypt, every shift of the metal, every creak of the settling stone sounded like the beginning of a detonation. They were guarding a bomb. The emperor, who had commanded armies, was now a volatile chemical reaction in a box. Meanwhile, the machinery of the empire had to turn. The king was dead. Long live the king. But where was the king? Joseph had left no male heir. His son, Leopold Joseph, had died in infancy, another victim of the genetic frailty of the line. This meant the crown now passed to his younger brother, Archduke Charles. But Charles was not in Vienna. He was 1,000 miles away in Barcelona, fighting a war to become the King of Spain. The irony was staggering. The entire War of the Spanish Succession, which had set Europe on fire for a decade, was about putting Charles on the Spanish throne. Joseph had spent his reign fighting for Charles's rights in Madrid, and now, with one breath of a virus, the board had been flipped. Charles was no longer the claimant to Spain. He was the Emperor of Austria. A courier was dispatched. He rode out of the Hofburg gates, his saddlebags heavy with the black-sealed letters that would change history. He rode through the lands that Joseph had ruled, through the forests of Austria, across the Alps, down into the heat of Spain. He carried the news of the death, but he could not carry the smell. He could not convey the horror of the black skin or the sound of the cracking neck. Those details were already being suppressed, pushed into the shadows of rumor. The official letters spoke of a violent fever and a Christian end. They sanitized the death, just as the servants were sanitizing the bedroom. When the news finally reached Charles in Barcelona, it must have felt like a curse. He was the last man standing. The Habsburg line, which had once seemed as numerous as the stars, had been whittled down by disease and madness, until only he remained. Charles VI, as he would become, was a different man from Joseph. He was stiffer, more formal, more obsessed with the rigid etiquette of the Spanish court. When he heard how his brother had died, the swiftness, the brutality of the black pox, it surely planted a seed of terror in him. He knew that the same blood ran in his veins. He knew that the same vulnerability to the invisible monsters of the air lay in his own immune system. He returned to Vienna not as a conqueror, but as a survivor walking into a graveyard. Back in Vienna, the rumors began to curdle. The city was a hotbed of gossip. The servants who had burned the bedsheets talked to the washerwomen. The undertakers who had soldered the lead talked to the tavern keepers. They say he turned black as coal, a merchant would whisper over a tankard of ale. They say he was so swollen he didn't look human. They say they had to break his bones to shut the box. The breaking of the neck became a grim urban legend. It was the kind of detail that the public latched onto because it brought the high and mighty down to the dirt. The idea that the Holy Roman Emperor had been snapped like a twig was a reminder that death is the great equalizer. It stripped away the divine aura. If God had chosen Joseph, why did God allow him to rot so violently? Why did God allow his body to be desecrated by the hands of plumbers and carpenters? The church worked hard to counter these whispers. Sermons were preached about the mystery of God's will. Elaborate requiem masses were held, filled with the soaring music of Fuchs, music designed to elevate the soul and distract the mind from the reality of the flesh. They built a catafalque, a temporary wooden structure representing the tomb, in the Augustinerkirche, draped in black velvet and silver, surrounded by thousands of candles. It was beautiful. It was majestic. It was a lie. The real Joseph was down in the crypt, fermenting in the dark. This disconnect between the public performance of death and the private reality of rot is the central theme of the Habsburg story. The Baroque era was obsessed with surfaces. It was an age of powdered wigs, of painted faces, of gilded stucco that looked like marble but was just plaster. It was a culture that tried to hide the decay of the world behind a mask of gold. But Joseph's death had torn the mask off. The black pox was not just a disease, it was a truth teller. It revealed that beneath the velvet there was only meat. It revealed that the blue blood of the dynasty clotted and stank just like the red blood of a peasant. In the weeks following the funeral, the court tried to return to normal. The new emperor, Charles VI, eventually arrived and took up residence in the Hofburg. He walked the same halls where his brother had died. He slept in a bedchamber not far from the one where the air had been poisoned. But the ghost of the trauma remained. Charles became obsessed with producing a male heir. He knew the line was hanging by a thread. He knew that if he died, perhaps of the same smallpox, perhaps of something else, the male line of the Habsburgs would end. He looked at the portraits of Joseph, the handsome, vibrant brother who was supposed to rule for decades, and he saw his own mortality staring back. The medical community of Vienna was also shaken. The failure to save Joseph was a humiliation for the faculty of medicine. They had bled him, purged him, dosed him, and watched him die in agony. They began to debate, fiercely and impotently, about the nature of the black pox. Was it in the blood? Was it in the bile? They wrote treatises describing the symptoms in horrifying detail: variola nigra, the bleeding into the skin, the hemorrhage of the membranes. These medical texts, written in dry Latin, are the only places where the truth was allowed to exist. In the archives of the University of Vienna, preserved on yellowing paper, are the clinical descriptions of the emperor's dissolution. They do not speak of his glory. They speak of his output, of bloody urine. They speak of the stench. And what of the crypt? The monks continued their vigil. Days turned into weeks. The immediate danger of the coffin bursting subsided as the biological processes inside slowly stabilized. The gas production peaked, and then, gradually, the soft tissues liquefied completely. Joseph I, inside his lead shell, was no longer a man. He was a skeleton floating in a slurry of his own dissolved remains. The golden prince had become dust and fluid. The breaking of his neck, that moment of supreme violence, became a secret kept by the stone walls. But it had changed the psychology of the crypt. The Capuchin friars knew that the boxes they guarded were not just resting places for the weary, they were prisons for the horrific. Years later, when Charles VI would die of poisoned mushrooms, another biological betrayal, he would join his brother in that cold room. He would be placed in a sarcophagus just as ornate, but the space between them would always be charged with the memory of April 1711. The death of Joseph I stands as a turning point. It was the moment the Baroque dream cracked. The dynasty would limp on. Maria Theresa would come. The empire would survive for another 2 centuries, but the illusion of invulnerability was gone. The black pox had proved that the crown offers no immunity. It had proved that nature is the true emperor of the world. From the safety of the modern world, it is easy to shudder and look away. Yet the sealed coffin demands attention. The crack of the bone, the smell of vinegar and rot, these are not merely grotesque details, because in that darkness lies the most profound lesson of history. We are all, from the beggar to the emperor, made of the same fragile stuff. And in the end, we all fit in the box, even if they have to break us to get us there. When the new emperor, Charles VI, arrived in Vienna, he did not see a crown. He saw a death sentence. The swiftness of Joseph's destruction terrified the courts of Europe more than any war. This terror became Joseph's true legacy. The memory of his blackened skin and the rumors of his broken neck pushed the aristocracy to finally accept inoculation, paving the way for the eventual defeat of the disease. But historical victory means nothing to the body in the box. If you visit the imperial crypt in Vienna today, you will see Joseph's sarcophagus. It is a masterpiece of Baroque art teeming with weeping cherubs and noble inscriptions calling him the victorious. Tourists admire the bronze, unaware of the secret behind the metal wall. Inside, stripped of his handsome flesh, the skeleton of the Golden Prince still lies, with his head detached from his spine, broken by the hands of terrified men just to make him fit. The sarcophagus is a beautiful lie designed to make us forget a messy biological truth, that nature is the true emperor of the world. In the end, the myth exploded. The man just died.